Hello and welcome to a More Perfect podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be continuing my interview with Golbon Rose. In the first part of this interview, we discussed the persecution in Iran of religious minorities and even of ordinary citizens. We also discussed the hardships of daily life in Iran and the deteriorating, dire, in my opinion, catastrophic economic situation there. It really is just god-awful. On a deeper level, we discussed staying true to yourself in the face of oppression and hardship. So, if you haven't listened to part 1, I encourage you to go back and check it out. Without further ado, let's pick up where we left off in the interview. So, getting back into the dark and terrible stuff, we were talking about protests earlier and the spirit of rebellion that they have. There was a big protest back in 2022. I don't know the specifics of it, but there was a huge uprising against the Iranian government. Do you know anything about that?
So Mahsa Amini was a Kurdish Iranian woman who was visiting Tehran, and she was wearing a hijab because she has to over there, but she had literally 2 pieces of her hair out of her hijab. She got arrested and they brutally beat her. She ended up actually suffering from internal bleeding and was comatose and then died 3 days later. And
Holy hell.
For 2 strands of her hair, and this poor girl wasn't even politically motivated or anything. She was just like this quiet schoolgirl who was just, about to go to school, was just visiting Tehran for a last minute trip for the last part of summer. And this just outraged so many people. You'll see videos of people cutting their hair in protest and burning their hijabs. And that's because cutting hair is like a act of grief that they had in, I think it's a Kurdish grieving ritual. I'm not sure, but I do know that it has like Kurdish roots. And she, so Mahsa is actually her Iranian name, Jina Mahsa Amini. They also suppress Kurds. They're like, oh, you can't even have a Kurdish name. It has to be Iranian. This just outraged everyone. And I don't know if you saw any protests where you were, but there were definitely some protests here in Washington State and around the world. People were protesting daily and night. There were cyber attacks on the central bank, which was so based. I love that, and I wish there would be some here. Sorry, my classic liberalism is coming out.
There you go. Yeah. So these were national protests over this slaughtering of this innocent girl.
Yes, and information has traveled fast. Well, this is just true about the world. Information travels faster. And so back in Iran, before the revolution, the Shah was trying to modernize Iran, make it very, I don't even want to say westernized, just like industrialized, modernized. And so the people that were upset were the ones in the rural areas that were not getting these freedoms, because Iran's geography makes it hard for information to travel. But what makes this different is that people are aware of what's going on. People have been aware. Mm-hmm. So these protests reached the most remote areas in Iran, like places like Sistan and Baluchistan, which is the most impoverished province of Iran that sits near the Pakistani border. Like, these people were even fed up and had known the realities of the regime, while, for example, 40 years ago, they wouldn't have known about like the Shah's plans and experience the prosperity that people in like Tehran were experiencing, because information was just not as fast and not as wide. You're not supposed to have social media over there. It is censored and everything, but people have VPNs. People find a way to make this information spread. So even people in Baluchistan and Sistan were having these protests, and they were met with the most brutal force when they did this.
What kind
So
of force, what kind of repression tactics did Iran use against these protesters all over the country? Again, because of this widespread information.
So they did two different ones. One of them was with physical brutality, it's where they deployed Hezbollah, not Iranian, Hezbollah agents to also go and crack down on the protests. Because, yeah. So, and then they also, over 500 people died because of these protests that were going on for months. And still, yeah, that was probably like the
Jesus.
more heightened part of the woman life freedom revolution. Now it's like smaller and more steady. And then another tactic they did was they shut down the internet when people started actually catching on the news of what's going on in Iran, because Iranians were reaching out on Twitter, reaching out on telegrams, and just disseminating I can't even say that word.
Disseminating
the information of what was going on in Iran. And so once they started getting global attention, they shut down the internet. And that is to stop people from being able to gather to protest, stop people from reaching out for global help. And
interesting.
Yeah, so the way that they weaponize internet, ridiculous. And
do they just
it goes
do
hand in hand with freedom of speech.
So there's no freedom of speech, and then they also have a propaganda machine, it sounds like, across the internet. So two things here that I want you to confirm. Number one, they use their network of terror, Hamas, Hezbollah, which they fund, against the protesters, and Houthis. Oh, okay. To suppress the protests. And two, they have a gigantic propaganda machine as well. Am I getting that right?
They do support Hezbollah, Houthi, and Hamas. However, it was Hezbollah that was a part of the attacks against the protesters. Okay. They fund these. 80% of Iran's resources goes to their terror network. And that is the reason why people are so poor, by the way, in Iran. And also, every natural source is like held by government instead of being privatized. And then there's also, price ceilings in place, price floors, and all of that. But
that never helps anything.
That is correct. Hezbollah was over there fighting against the Iranians that were protesting for basic civil liberties, basic human rights, just like the regard of being humans. Also, yes, there is a vast propaganda machine here in the West. And again, it's one of those topics where I sound like a crazy conspiracy theorist, as they like to call it. But
go for it.
This is real. This also has an overlap with Marxism.
Okay, I'm ready.
Because so socialists, for example, I did extensive research on this because I had to. But it is part of their plans of revolution is to encourage more Marxists to become teachers and educators. And
that's totally correct. Yes.
Yeah. And the Islamic Republic does that as well with professors abroad. So they will send professors to come here to teach things like economics or teach things like political science or sociology or whatever. It will be very pro-Islamic Republic rhetoric. And so that's why you see so many people who are supposed to be smart at Western elite universities being the way that they are. They are just doing what they're taught. They're taught that everything they know about the Middle East is through these universities, but also now it's also through social media. So they will have propagandists. They will have, for example, Iran will pay Russian influencers to come and do a trip in Iran. It's really funny.
Are you serious?
Yeah, you'll see people being like, "Oh, just another day in Iran," and it's just like,
oh my
"Girl,
God.
what Iran are you living in? It's not what are you living in? Iran, Texas? Because there is a town named Iran, Texas, and it has freedom, but Iran, The country does not. And the thing is, it's not even Iran anymore. That's the thing. Like when I said Iranians are nationalistic, we're nationalistic about Iran. We're not nationalistic about the Islamic Republic. And okay, anyways, going back to the propaganda. And then they've also deeply infiltrated the Democratic Party and the special envoy to Iran of Barack Obama's administration and the Biden administration. So
this is real. This is real.
Yep.
I'm familiar with this, but please go on. Yes.
So, and then there's also a lobby group called NIAC, National Iranian American Council. And get this, it was established by someone who's not even like an American national. This person is a Swedish citizen. So Trita Parsi. And so basically they say that they're just anti-war and anti-sanctions, but Iranian people are just like, well, you know what? Like, fuck it. Like, sanction us. Like, life already here freaking sucks. But like, it'll suck less if, the Islamic Republic is less weak. So yeah, we have these propagandists who have deeply infiltrated the Democratic Party, deeply infiltrated Western academics, and now social media. And also they are the ones funding protests along with Soros that are funding like the protests that we've seen on campuses recently. They're the ones funding.
Interesting. So Iran is funding, or at least in part, funding these protests that we've been seeing on campus against the Israeli war in Gaza.
Yep, basically. And
that's
also
insane.
There's this foundation that was first called the Pahlavi Foundation. That was the Shah's foundation. And once the Islamic Republic established themselves over there in Iran, they seized the foundation and they seized an additional $50 million of assets of people that were within the Shah's cabinet. And
the Shah,
yeah. So they seized it and they dropped the Pahlavi and made it Alavi Foundation. And the report I sent you, I think we should definitely link it for this, but that
I will absolutely link it in the podcast description for all this. It covers all the Iranian influence and assassinations inside of the United States, like inside of our borders. Iran has taken all these actions, as Golbon has said. They even set up foundations and apparently been funding the protests as well, which is news to me. I'll definitely be linking that report for sure. That's terrifying. That's terrifying to put it lightly.
It's so frustrating, and
it's gotta be. It's gotta be really frustrating to see all these people being duped. I mean, we used to be taught all these things in school, like math, science, etc., and these values like separation of government between the executive, judicial, the three branches of government. Yes, thank you. The separation of powers. I should know this. And the separation of religion and government. But now our higher education centers are being not only influenced by Iran, but they're also being infiltrated by China on one end. And then our enemies have a hook into our higher education centers, which can never be a good thing. It can never be beneficial to us as a country.
People in Iran freely gave away their freedoms. Well, not everyone, in 1979, because they believed the lofty lies of the Ayatollah and believed that Western imperialism was the root of the evil, the real reason why people were poor, when in reality, the Islamist and Marxist dogmas are what led to the destruction of Iran at the end.
I see.
And so this is it's really frustrating because Iranians have been, even like being an American citizen here, you're still not like completely free if you have family in Iran, because they can pay the overall price of your freedom. And so it sucks because people just don't listen to Iranians because they're like, oh, well, source, there's like, oh yeah, well, these academics say this. And so the propaganda machine has gone so vast, and people do a real big disservice by not listening to these Iranians that are like, hey, look, you're being dumb and you're going to sign off your freedoms away. And
Yeah.
just it's so hard. And then back to that nationalistic view, a lot of Iranians, actually all Iranians that move to anywhere as refugees, they become deeply patriotic for that country. So, I'm sitting here and I'm seeing people that have been born here, that have never lived anywhere else, and they are acting so un-American. It's so un-American to allow these things to happen, allow foreign actors to determine our democracy and to determine what, like, our thoughts.
You were saying it's un-American for what now?
It's un-American for foreign actors determine the future of our democracy and the future of our society. And so,
I see.
I think that people need to be listening to Iranians who are taking a risk to practice the freedoms that they have here, So it's kind of a big slap in the face.
Especially courageous people like yourself who are actively speaking out against the regime there, against the Islamic Republic, against the Islamofascism that's going on there. And people like yourself that have this knowledge and this experience of true oppression. How does that knowledge shape the way that you see the world? Do you see the United States differently because you know what it could be?
Knowing true oppression has made my biggest value to be freedom, absolute freedom. I think that because I know what oppression is, I definitely am more skeptical of people trying to fearmonger here, being like, oh, let's save democracy, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I think because I've actually seen oppression, it's made me want less government instead of more government. Less regulations instead of more regulations. I think being an Iranian has made me want small government and more individual liberty.
A question on that. What's your opinion on the separation of religion and government? Should there be a state-mandated religion? Were the founders right to separate it?
Hell yeah, they were. I think we need to go back to just thinking like our founding fathers, because they escaped tyranny. They kind of know what the hell we're talking about when they said the separation of power, separation of church, and powers, but separation of church and state. Because what you see then is legislated morality, which I do think we need morals, but it needs to be something that is brought on by society. It should be like a cultural, societal change instead of a government one. If they can tell you how to live your lives one day, that's just a really bad precedent for what comes next. And so
I see.
I don't think
go on.
Freedom of religion is also freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, free thinking. So absolutely there should be a separation of church and state.
So you're saying that there should be a separation of church and state, but would you say that there's any areas of society where religious values should be mandated? Should they mandate religion in schools? What would you say to that? Some people, they want to, and they do exist here, Christian schools do exist here, but they would like Christian values to be taught in public schools as well. What would you say to those people that don't necessarily want a state-mandated religion, but they want religion to be mandated in certain sectors of society?
Honestly, I could see why they want that because of the postmodernistic weird reality we live in now, with where, religion is I will say, I understand that, I totally understand that. But with that saying, I don't think it needs to be mandated. I think that, morals, things like that should be taught by parents. Parents should have a say in that, not by educators. Educators should be making sure that we're learning our math and our English classes, all of that stuff. They should help develop a smart society. But when it comes to public schools, I don't think so. I don't think religion should be mandated at all, because that's also a talk of tax dollars. Is there not everyone's going to be represented by that, because that's what's funding these public schools. So
Do you
I
think
would say
do you think it sets a bad precedent?
it does. And also, I think that I do see the reason why that people want it mandated, but I don't think it needs to be mandated. I think instead there just needs to be some changes in what people are allowed to teach. Like, for example, the teacher unions here in Washington State are horrendous.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've
So
heard the teachers unions are basically a leftist group masquerading as a helpful group in society, but in reality they're just, an activist group.
basically, yeah.
Correct me if I'm
Um,
wrong.
no. Yeah, you're totally right. Just seeing some of the things that teachers teach here with the social justice shit, like I would just like lose my marbles.
I hear what you're saying. So that kind of leads me into my final questions. What advice would you give for those experiencing oppression and persecution today?
I honestly don't know what advice to give.
What is the legacy that you want to leave? If you had to think of yourself in the future, what legacy do you want your activism to leave?
I think I want my legacy to be someone that seeks for truth while also emphasizing on unity. I'm not leading with hate when I say these things. I am leading with the truth. Really, I just want to unite people against tyranny. Forget, identity politics. Underneath all that, we are all Americans. I think we need to put America first before everything else, unite people, and also stand for the truth.
It was a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you. Thank for everything you said. I feel like a lot of people are gonna have a new perspective on Iran and also on freedom and justice and unity because of what you said on the show today. Thanks for coming on. I really loved having you on the show.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to my interview with Golbon Rose. I hope you learned a lot about Iran. I certainly learned a lot about Iran, so much that I can't even begin to quantify it. I really hope that in the future, the Iranian people can see a brighter path forward. I hope that one day the brutal regime in Iran can be lifted from the people and that the people of Iran can truly be free. The Middle East is super complicated and I can never understand all of it. I doubt any of us can, except if you're like a super duper specialist. But it's important that we recognize evil when we see it, and it's even more important that we recognize that the freedoms that we have in this country are not to be taken for granted. They're not to be caricaturized as oppression, but rather we should be grateful for them. We should be grateful for our freedom of speech, for our freedom of religion, and for all the other freedoms that we have here, because freedom ain't free. As always, please share this podcast with all your friends, with all your family, and with everybody you know. Thank you for listening, and have a more perfect day.